The Princess and the Podcast Deal. From Brisbane, the latest from podnews.net with co-host, powerful podcast hosting for agencies and brands. Archewell, the podcast company owned by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, will not have its contract renewed with Spotify. The decision was mutual, according to a statement. But speaking on his podcast, Bill Simmons, who's a senior Spotify podcast executive, said this.
I wish I had been involved in the Meghan and Harry leave Spotify negotiation. The grifters. That's the podcast we should have launched with them.
Meghan Markle's podcast produced just 12 episodes in a $20 million contract. The Wall Street Journal suggests that she might not earn the full amount after not meeting productivity clauses. We've heard from multiple sources that some interviews on the show were done by other staffers, with her questions edited in afterwards. Will Page, former chief economist at Spotify, did this maths for BBC Radio 4's The World Tonight.
Harry and Meghan earned more than Blinding Lights, which was by the fantastic Canadian band The Weeknd, and is the most streamed song ever on Spotify, which is not bad for 12 hours work.
Elsewhere, Podium has launched a new tool that turns your podcast into a book. Called Podbook, the tool will turn any podcast into anything from a 20-page ebook to a 250-page paperback-like read. Podcasters can join the waitlist, and we link to a sample today made from Huberman Lab. Co-host has released a white paper about podcast analytics detailing key metrics, measurement techniques and industry best practices. The free download also gives tips on how to take action with your data. Anchor shut down my podcast and never paid me, claims a Redditor who says they own $700. Storyboard, a platform for internal and private podcasting, has added Chat by Storyboard, a new app letting teams communicate using voice messages with AI-powered transcripts. The Independent Podcast Awards have partnered with the Podcasting Seriously Awards Fund. The fund covers submission fees for producers, editors and others from underrepresented backgrounds. In the UK, the Cheerful Earful Podcast Festival is to return to London in Q4, with some of the country's biggest comedy shows performing live. In Portugal, consultancy Widecom has launched a podcast unit called Zico, Podcast Creative Agency. It claims to be a landmark in the production of podcasts for individuals, brands and institutions. And Earbuds this week focuses on episodes celebrating Juneteenth, chosen by Justin Richmond. It's time for some tech stuff, and Facebook's owner Meta has announced an artificial speech generator which can clone voices, edit and remove background noise. It's a few months since Apple removed Apple Core Media as a user agent of its app, and the results? Apple Podcasts download figures are up 4%. Says OP3, we predicted 6%. Podcastdata.org is a new data website allowing anyone to query podcast index data and produce pretty graphs from it. We link to an example of that. The average episode length of all podcasts by different languages. Shows in Hindi and Chinese are the shortest, and shows in Serbian and Bulgarian are, on average, 5 times longer. And in podcast news, it's the 25th anniversary of Sex and the City, and Just Like That, The Writer's Room podcast has, for the first time ever, Sarah Jessica Parker, Cynthia Nixon and Kristin Davis in conversation with writer, director, executive producer and host Michael Patrick King. The podcast unpacks the show's casting process, evolution of characters, a scrapped storyline, iconic guest stars and more. A new relationships podcast from Punky Johnson, Love Thang, launches today on SiriusXM's Laugh Out Loud radio. From Inc. magazine, Computer Freaks is new, a 6-part limited series podcast about the untold history of the internet, straight from the mouths of its pioneering inventors. And Patricia Bright's podcast returns for a new season and a new name. The Break brings together high-profile guests and thought-provoking discussions. The show, formerly known as Caught Off Guard, is now brought under Patricia Bright's successful online community. It's published by Listen. This podcast is sponsored by Co-Host and Quill. Agencies and brands need better podcast analytics. Discover companies that listen to your podcast, where downloads are coming from and how listeners are resonating with Co-Host at cohostpodcasting.com. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.